Most people believe aging is something that happens to you. Jung believed it was something you either engage with or something that defeats you. Not physically, psychologically. He watched people enter their 60s and 70s and split into two completely different trajectories. Some contracted, became smaller, retreated from life as though the best of it was already behind them. Others expanded, became more fully themselves than they had ever been. Discovered, in the second half of life, something they had been too busy to find in the first. The difference was never about the body. It was always about what they did with their interior life. Today we go into exactly that. 7 specific hobbies, backed by both Jungian psychology and modern science, that don't just slow aging after 60, they reverse it. 1. Writing. Specifically, writing to yourself. Jung kept a journal for most of his adult life. Not a record of events, not a productivity log, a genuine, private, honest dialogue with his own interior. The Red Book, his most personal journal, kept during the most tumultuous years of his psychological development, was not published until nearly 50 years after his death. Because it was never written for anyone else. It was written for the conversation. The conversation between the conscious and the unconscious, between the self that manages daily life and the deeper self that has been trying to communicate something for years. Modern neuroscience has now confirmed what Jung observed clinically. Regular expressive writing, not diary keeping, not social posting, but genuine private reflection, produces measurable changes in brain function. It activates the prefrontal cortex, strengthens neural pathways associated with emotional regulation, reduces the physiological stress response, and, critically for aging, maintains the cognitive flexibility that is one of the first casualties of a mind that stops being genuinely challenged. But beyond the neuroscience, Jung's insight points at something deeper. The person who writes to themselves, honestly, without an audience, without performance, is doing something that almost no other activity provides. They are creating a genuine relationship with their own interior. And after 60, when the external roles that structured identity for decades begin to fall away, when the career ends, when the children leave, when the question of who you are without the roles you played becomes suddenly, urgently real, the person who has this relationship with their interior has something the person who doesn't is completely unprepared for. A self that exists independently of every role. A rich, complex, continuously developing interior life that does not require external structure to feel real and purposeful. Writing, after 60, is not a hobby. It is the maintenance of the most important relationship available to a human being. The relationship with yourself. Start with 10 minutes. No editing, no audience, no purpose beyond honest contact with what is actually there. The brain that writes regularly at 70 looks, on a scan, decades younger than the brain that stopped being genuinely honest with itself. 2. Learning a musical instrument, especially one you've never played. Jung believed that the second half of life has a specific psychological task. The development of the qualities that were suppressed or undeveloped in the first half. The person who spent 40 years being analytical develops the feeling function. The person who spent 40 years performing for others develops genuine solitude. The person who spent 40 years being practical develops the capacity for play. Learning a musical instrument after 60 is one of the most powerful versions of this development available. Not because music is pleasant, because of what learning it actually requires. It requires the adult brain to do something it has been avoiding for decades. Be a beginner. This is not a small thing. After 60, most people have spent 40 years becoming expert, becoming the person who knows, whose competence is established, whose authority is recognized, whose identity is built on the accumulated mastery of something. The beginner position, fumbling, uncertain, frequently wrong, dependent on a teacher who knows more, is one that the established adult identity finds genuinely threatening. And this threat is exactly where the growth lives. Neuroscientists at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development found that learning a musical instrument in later life produces measurable increases in gray matter density in the regions associated with motor control, auditory processing, and, most significantly, executive function. The planning, the sequencing, the coordination of multiple systems simultaneously, required by even basic musical playing, exercises neural networks that routine daily life leaves increasingly unstimulated. But Jung's insight adds a dimension the neuroscience cannot capture. The person who learns an instrument after 60 is doing something psychologically profound. They are choosing growth over comfort. They are choosing the discomfort of genuine learning over the safety of established competence. And in making that choice, repeatedly, every time they sit down with the instrument and face the gap between where they are and where the music wants them to be, they are exercising the most important muscle available to the aging mind. The muscle of remaining genuinely alive to experience. 3. Painting, drawing, or any visual art, without caring about the result. Here is where Jung's personal practice becomes directly relevant. During the years he called his confrontation with the unconscious, the period of profound inner upheaval that followed his break with Freud, Jung painted. Not because he was a painter. He had no particular training or talent. He painted because he discovered that images could access something that words could not. The unconscious, as Jung understood it, does not think in language. It thinks in images, in symbols, in the visual language of dreams and myth, and the body's felt sense of things. Writing reaches certain layers of the interior. Visual art reaches others. The person who has never made visual art, who reaches for a brush or a pencil or a piece of clay after 60, is not taking up a hobby. They are opening a channel that has been closed for most of their adult life. The channel through which the non-verbal, non-rational, non-linear intelligence of the unconscious psyche can express itself. Modern research confirms the neurological dimension. A study published in the journal Gerontology found that visual art activities in older adults produced significant improvements in psychological resilience, specifically in the ability to adapt to change and loss. The artists showed measurably lower rates of depression, lower rates of cognitive decline, and, most strikingly, higher reported sense of purpose than matched groups engaged in other leisure activities. But Jung would point at something the study couldn't measure. The person who makes art, badly, privately, without caring about the result, is doing something that the result-oriented adult mind almost never does, making something for its own sake, for the process rather than the product, for the experience of creation rather than the reception of the created thing. This is what play actually is. And play, genuine, purposeless, absorbed play, is one of the things the aging mind most desperately needs and most consistently denies itself. After 60, buy the cheap paints, make the bad painting, show it to no one if you prefer. The brain that made it will be different from the brain that didn't. 4. Gardening, the one hobby that connects every Jungian principle. If Jung had designed a single activity to embody everything he believed about psychological health and human development, it would look remarkably like gardening. Consider what gardening actually requires. Physical presence in the natural world, the original environment in which the human psyche developed and to which it still responds at a cellular level. Engagement with cycles of time that are not human in their scale, the season, the growth, the decay, the renewal, that put the human lifespan in its proper proportion. The practice of tending rather than controlling, learning to work with the nature of things rather than imposing your will on them. The immediate, physical, sensory experience of cause and effect, of action and result, that the abstract, screen-mediated adult world consistently fails to provide. And, crucially, the regular encounter with death and renewal. The plant that doesn't survive the frost. The flower that blooms for 3 days. The tomato that arrives in August and is gone by September. Jung believed that one of the central psychological tasks of the second half of life is the development of a genuine, non-anxious relationship with mortality. Not the suppression of death anxiety. The honest, continuous, embodied encounter with the cycle of which human life is simply a part. Gardening provides this encounter in a form that is neither dramatic nor abstract. The dead plant is simply dead, and the seed going into the ground in spring is simply a seed. And both are part of the same process that the gardener, kneeling in the dirt, is also part of. Research from the University of Exeter found that gardening activities in adults over 60 produced measurable reductions in cortisol, the primary stress hormone associated with biological aging. Regular gardeners showed lower rates of dementia, lower rates of depression, and higher rates of what researchers called active engagement with life, a quality that predicted longevity more reliably than almost any other single factor. But the Jungian insight is more specific than the research. Gardening, practiced attentively, is a conversation with the earth, with the original teacher of the human psyche, the one whose rhythms are older than consciousness itself, and whose lessons, about patience, about tending, about the difference between what you can control and what you must simply witness, are available to anyone willing to put their hands in the dirt. 5. Teaching, formally or informally, what you have learned. Jung believed that the accumulated experience of a human life has a purpose beyond the person who accumulated it. The concept he used was the transmission of the individual to the culture. The specific, irreplaceable, experientially earned understanding that arrives only through having lived long enough to see patterns across decades, and that is genuinely lost if it is not somehow passed on. This is not ego, this is ecology. The person who has lived 60 or 70 years carries something genuinely rare. The knowledge of how things actually work, not in theory, not from a textbook, but from having been through it, having failed in the way you fail, having learned what you learn from that, having recovered in the specific way you recover, and arrived at the understanding you arrived at. This knowledge, embodied, experiential, hard-won, is not available anywhere else. Not in any course, not in any book, not in any amount of research. It is available only from you. And the act of teaching it, formally, in a class or a workshop or a mentoring relationship, or informally, in the conversations that happen with younger people who are genuinely asking, does something specific to the brain of the person doing the teaching. Research from Northwestern University found that adults who engaged in mentoring and teaching activities showed measurably slower cognitive decline than matched non-teaching groups. The mechanism appears to be the specific cognitive demand of translation. Taking what you know, embodied, implicit, felt, and finding the words and structures and examples that make it transmissible. This translation requires precisely the kind of active, flexible, effortful cognitive engagement that reverses the passive decline of a mind that has stopped being challenged. But Jung's insight points deeper. The person who teaches what they have learned is doing something that satisfies one of the deepest psychological needs of the second half of life, the need for generativity. The felt sense that your presence on Earth has produced something that will outlast you, that the specific experience of your specific life has been useful to someone, that you mattered, not in the abstract, but in the concrete, personal, this person asked and you answered sense. Find someone younger who is where you have been. Tell them what you know, not as lecture, as conversation, as the genuine, generous, freely given transmission of everything the years have taught you. The brain that does this lives longer. The person doing it lives better. 6. Physical movement that requires genuine attention. Not exercise in the modern sense. Not the treadmill watched while checking email. Not the routine repeated so many times it has become unconscious. Movement that requires your full, undivided, genuinely present attention to execute. Tai Chi, yoga, dance, a martial art, even simply walking in genuinely unfamiliar terrain that requires you to attend to every step. Jung was deeply aware of something that Western psychology had systematically ignored for most of its history. The body is not a vehicle for the mind. It is part of the psyche. The emotions are not mental events that happen to produce physical symptoms. They are physical events that the mind interprets after the fact. The unconscious does not live only in the brain. It lives in the entire body, in the chronic tension of muscles that learn to brace against something that happened decades ago, in the breath that became shallow in response to a threat that is no longer present, in the posture that tells a story about self-worth that the conscious mind would never articulate. Movement that requires full attention reaches this bodily layer of the unconscious in ways that no amount of cognitive reflection can. The Tai Chi practitioner, who must be fully present